between reading the book and hearing Springsteen's voice, I was inspired. And it was an inspiration that took me in a different path than the one that I probably was set out upon. Because when I graduated from Acadia, I had a scholarship to go to University of Denver Law School. Because philosophy majors, if you do well in philosophy, that's usually an indicator that you'll do well in the LSAT exam, and I did, and then I got a scholarship, and I got out to Denver, and I went, I do not want to be a lawyer. I want to be a writer. After reading that book, and after some of the things that some of my teachers said to me in high school, hey, you have a flair for this, you can be a writer, I decided to leave law school. I went to University of Florida. I took a master's degree in creative writing, and I've been poor ever since. Poor and happy. So that book really changed my mind about what I was going to do. I was going to end up doing what I really wanted to do. And it took me quite some time and 5 other books where I wrote about things that weren't related to Kerouac at all, just to establish my own voice as a writer and get started on my own career. And then one day, my friend Keith, who had just published his first book, same guy that gave me On the Road way back when, called me up and said, I got a great idea for your next book. I said, what's that? This was like this was January of 2007. I said, what's that? He said, why don't you recreate the 5 major trips that Jack Kerouac took in his book On the Road, do it on the 50th anniversary of the publication of On the Road, which was 2007, and in the year of your 50th birthday, which was 2007. So I went, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't you do it? He was like, well, I want you to do it. I said, well, why do you want me to do it? He said, well, I think you can create characters better than I can. You can draw characters and make them so we can understand them. And I said, you're just doing this to get back at me, aren't you? And he said, yeah, because I'd given him the idea for his first book. And his first book is called The Tecate Journal's 70 Days on the Rio Grande. And I convinced him that he should go the length of the Rio Grande, which separates the United States from Mexico. And it's a beautiful, desolate, and very dangerous place because of drug trafficking, because of Mexican gangs, because of wild animals, because of a lot of things. But there are 2 national parks that are just spectacular, that straddle the border. And he had done rafting, kayaking, and canoe trips on every section of the river, but never in one long trip. And at the beginning, the river is so shallow and so small, you have to mountain bike for the first like 30 or 40 miles. So he needed help at certain places so he could leave his bike with someone, get in a raft, go to the next place, leave his raft with someone, and then get a canoe and go from there to the ocean. He was like, you son of a bitch, that's a great idea. But so he did it. Now he's paying me back with this idea where you should take all the trips that Kerouac took. And you'll have to hitchhike, and you'll have to go to San Francisco, and you'll have to go to Mexico City. And I was like, I think I will. I think I'll do it. So I did. So I'm going to read a couple short parts of the book. It'll give you an idea of some of the things that happened that were comic and some of the things that happened that were scary. So this is the second trip I took. It was out of New York, and I was in the Upper West Side of New York, and I was going to hitchhike in 2007 out of New York City, as Kerouac does at the beginning of On the Road. And I was going to hitchhike. At the beginning of Kerouac's book, On the Road, his character, Sal Paradise, which is based on himself, that's where the name Paradise Road comes from for the book. Because in the 1957 published version of On the Road, the central character is Sal Paradise. In 2007, they also published the original scroll version of Kerouac's On the Road, the famous one that he typed on one long skein of paper, which actually has gone on a Jim Irsay, the owner of the Indianapolis Colts football team, bought that scroll from Kerouac's estate for $2.8 million. Believe it or not, Kerouac never made any money as a writer, but now his one surviving in-law is a freaking millionaire because of how rich he is off in Kerouac's work, but that's the story for another day. So the scroll version exists. In that version, he just calls himself Jack. He's Jack Kerouac. And there are some parts of it that are quite different from the 1957 version. It's generally the same, but it's a little different. The scroll has made a trip around the country at various times with a professional curator, keeping it in a glass case so it doesn't get damaged. And it did visit Lowell, and they had a week-long celebration to celebrate Kerouac himself, to celebrate the scroll, to talk about the book and its place in American literature. So at the beginning of the book, he thinks he's going to hitchhike all the way on Route 6, I think it is, out of New York to Chicago, and then out to Denver, and then out to the West Coast. He only gets about 30 miles in his original hitchhiking effort. He gets out to a place in lower New York State called Bear Mountain. It's not very far outside of Manhattan. He doesn't get very far at all. It's a deluge of rain. He's not properly equipped. He doesn't have the right rain gear. He has a pair of like Mexican Huarache shoes made out of woven reeds that fall apart in the rain. And he ends up going back to New York. It's a little bit disconcerting and a little bit discouraging for the guy that was the king of the road to not get very far. Then he goes back to New York and he takes a bus from New York to Chicago, if you recall from the novel. So what I decided to do was I was going to hitchhike out of New York City, roughly in the same direction. Instead of going to Bear Mountain, turn around and go back, I was going to hitchhike to David Amram's house. David Amram is a friend of Kerouac's. He's still alive, quite healthy, and quite active. He's a musician and composer. And he was the fellow that wrote the created the soundtracks for two films that you've probably seen, Splendor in the Grass and The Manchurian Candidate. He still plays something like 200 gigs a year. He plays with Philharmonic orchestras. He plays with Willie Nelson every year at Farm Aid, which was last weekend. So this guy Amram is amazing. He's an 80-year-old guy who looks like he's probably about 50. And he plays music with everybody and anybody. And he was a friend of Kerouac's in the late 1950s. And he was one of the first people to ever play musical accompaniment in a Greenwich Village bar when Kerouac read from his work with jazz musicians backing him. It was this guy Amram. So I said, Amram's house in Peaksville Valley, New York is roughly about the same distance out of Manhattan as Bear Mountain was, so I'm going to hitchhike to his house. And then from there, I'll have a visit with him, I'll capture it for the book, then I'll go back to New York, and that's the end of that trip, and then the next trip I'll take a bus to Chicago, because I had to teach, coach hockey, and raise my son, whereas when Kerouac was taking the trips, he was in his early 20s and he didn't have any responsibility, so he could take the trips one after another. I had to take a trip for a couple of weeks and then go back to my life, write up the first trip, and then try to schedule it so I could take another trip. It's a lot harder when you have middle-age responsibilities than it is when you're 25, like he was. So here was my attempt at hitchhiking, which I hadn't done in nearly 30 years. The bicycle overpass spanning the Henry Hudson Highway is less than 100 yards from the store. I cinch the straps on my backpack and tramp over this light, flexible arch, my boots chiming against the metal as I reach the zenith and go booming down the other side. My spirits have been galvanized for the task at hand, with the ginger burning at my throat and my sinuses filled with the tang of wheatgrass. Cars are hurtling below me at deadly speeds. Traversing the footbridge, I'm mindful of a rambling man named Jack, not Kerouac or even Eliot, but Jack London. Kerouac devoured London's books as a young man and set out to be an adventurer and sojourner himself. What intrigued me about the unnamed prospector in London's To Build a Fire was his absolute belief in his own abilities. And although his hubris resulted in his demise, it was thrilling to see him travel over the inhospitable white expanse of the Yukon. Exposed to 107 degrees of frost, the man's only disconcerting thought was, quote, that he had not devised a nose strap of the sort that Bud wore in cold snaps, unquote. The story glowed as I read along, like an old movie where light accents the pages of a book, and I was left to ponder London's maxim: any man who was a man could travel alone. In the shadow of the George Washington Bridge, I lean over the Jersey barrier and survey the cars whizzing toward me. On the other side of the road is the breakdown lane, separated from Upper Manhattan by a 50-foot wall made of granite blocks. I need to cross 3 lanes of fast-moving traffic on a bad leg so I can start hitchhiking. For this, I need a break of 15 or 20 seconds between cars. And for what seems like a half hour, there isn't one, and I have time to reconsider my plans. Kerouac was lucky. He left New York with $50 in his pocket. I only have 36. And the last time I hitchhiked with any regularity back and forth between Lake Winnipesaukee and Meredith, New Hampshire, and my home in Methuen, Massachusetts, was almost 30 years ago. It was the summer I graduated from college, and, tanned very dark from working on Bear Island, I made it home once a week to play for my soccer team, the Wanderers FC, in the old City League. We appeared in the finals that year, and on my last long hitch, a pretty blonde in a VW convertible picked me up, and we raced down I-93 with the Allman Brothers wailing over the radio and long streaming tendrils of her hair whipping my face. Now, I'm a fledgling geriatric in orthopedic shoes, and my old soccer cleats are in a trunk gathering dust somewhere. Inside my backpack are my dirty cycling togs, a road map, 2 pints of water, half a dozen energy bars, a couple of paperbacks, my cell phone, a composition book, and a phalanx of undersharpened pencils. It occurs to me that I've been trying over these action-packed years, to preserve my life through rest and reading, proper nutrition, abstinence, persistence, and Zen-like stillness, to extend the foreground of the great narrative epic I'm engaged in. Now, I should be trying to throw it away. At age 50, surviving mostly intact, I have to crank up the intensity of what I'm doing, bringing a more reckless edge to the force I'm applying to the world and its obstacles. Otherwise, there's no point in making it this far with so much gas in the tank, so much energy waiting to be burned up in pursuit of what's left. That's Kerouac's message as I read it and hear it. Finally, there's a lull in the traffic, and I glump across the wide stretch of pavement and throw myself over the barrier on the other side, letting out a long yee-haw. After a moment, I collect myself, lift my shoulders, and take a long breath, and exhale it sharply. My heart is beating fast as I straighten out my pack straps, swing one leg and then the other over the Jersey barrier, and stick out my thumb. It's almost noon. The sun's out for the time being, and I'm standing almost flush with a gabled stone wall more than 5 stories high and covered with graffiti that keeps the bulge of Upper Manhattan from spilling into the Hudson. The voice inside my head says, "It, I'm taking a shot." In front of me is a small opening between the Jersey barriers that affords a little protection from the oncoming cars. As they go rushing past, the faces of the occupants are frozen for a moment like instamatic pictures, very clear and yet somehow indistinct at the same time, like police mugshots or the photographs of Civil War dead. As my upraised arm begins to tire, these images take on a sinister quality, and irrational fears invade my thoughts. I have been warned of kidnappings and murders, of the terrible nameless psychopaths and sociopaths that wander the highways and byways of today's America. Nobody hitchhikes anymore, my friends and family members have said, and with good reason.